Welcome back to the Midnight Mirage School of Higher Learning. Just want to thank the ladies and gentlemen for tuning in once again for another classic. Before we move forward, I just want to thank those who have sent donations, those who have purchased the book recently. Very, very appreciative and thankful for you people. You help us, keep progress moving forward here in the Midnight Mirage. In tonight's tape, what I want to do is talk about the history of the Boule and quote-unquote black Greek fraternities, sororities, and secret societies. A few years ago, I made a tape on this, and I want to update it. And what we're going to do is use certain historical accounts and historical record that is recorded in the Bible, okay? So we're going to talk about the history of the Boule and the quote-unquote black Greek fraternities, sororities, and secret societies. Because some of you all know, when you have people that go to college, and some of them may pledge to join some of these sororities and fraternities. But for some reason, you see the Greco-Roman or the Greek culture associated with these quote unquote black fraternities. So one may ask themselves, what is the history and what is the origin of so-called black people or indigenous Shemitic people associating themselves with Greco-Roman or Greek culture, joining certain groups and societies that practice Greco-Roman culture? OK, so we're going to talk about that and connect that to the Boule and some of the other things that are going on today. All right. So we're going to answer some questions about who are the ancestors of the modern day, quote unquote, black Greek fraternities, sororities, and secret societies. And we're going to talk about the Hellenized Judeans and Hellenized Israelites. OK, the resources that I'm going to use, for one, is going to be the book that I wrote, America, a Moorish Paradise of the Plumed Serpent. If you want to purchase this book, please hit me up in the email, midnightmirage009@gmail.com. That's midnightmirage009@gmail.com. And if you want to purchase the book, you email me, you tell me your name and your address. And after that, I will give you the Cash App, and you can send, the cost of the book to the Cash App. The Cash App is $Mirage Books, $Mirage Books. So if you're feeling, fruitful and you want to just do a donation, then, go ahead and help your boy out, send me a little inspiration. But the resources is going to be my book, America, a Moorish Paradise of the Plumed Serpent. And as I said before, we're going to use the Bible as well. OK, so first we want to start on page 49, because as I said, there was a certain point in time in history where Shemitic peoples were introduced to the Greco-Roman culture. And I talked about that a little bit in chapter 3 of my book called The Iron Age of Atlantis. So on page 49, I'm going to read maybe one or two paragraphs just to give us somewhat of a prelude or an introduction to the tape. Attis, the incubus Greek god, gives us a prime example of the types of cults behind government in dirty Greece. In the mythos, Attis refuses his full manhood because of his hatred of Venus, the symbol of feminine energy. He was described as Notha Mulier because of his sexual ambiguity, and Attis chose to live the life of a female and take on gender fluid qualities. Post the transition, Attis regrets his choice, also making him a god of confusion. He is the transgender sun god Apollo, who self-mutilates and brings new life under the spring equinox. Eunuchs of Attis were also neutered, and many lived as lovers to pansexual Greeks of the day. Transgender acts were performed by Hellenistic kings and Roman emperors, a transition only thought possible for a god. One of the most homicidal kings of bleached out Rome was Nero, the pansexual who epitomized incubus psychology. Transgender Roman kings were depicted as goddesses on Roman coins. It is recorded Nero was married to two men, Sporus and Pythagoras. Sporus was a castrated boy or a catamite, which were boys groomed for sexual purposes by men. Nero would dress Sporus up in women's clothing and makeup, parading the, quote, delicate boy, end quote, around in customary Roman empress fashion. The other illicit relationship of Nero was with Pythagoras, only this time with a twist. Unlike with Sporus, Nero himself transitions into the female and publicly marries Pythagoras wearing bridal attire. According to Roman historian Suetonius, Nero completed the gender swap with, quote, very loud cries of pleasure he produced on the first night, end quote. So what we did real quickly is just get an introduction to the mindset in ancient Greco-Roman culture that only the ruling elite or the kings, the people of the aristocracy, had the ability to transition into a god. And a lot of these god and goddess figures of the old world, really no matter what civilization they come from, were transgender, or they would switch between both sexes. Okay. So you would have a lot of, Greco-Roman kings would depict themselves as goddesses sometimes. So sometimes you would have a Grecian king, but he would depict himself as Athena. Or sometimes you may have a Roman king and he would depict himself as Venus. So like in this situation where it talks about Nero and how he had, two homosexual, relationships. But in one relationship, he performed as if he was the male. And in the other relationship, he performed as if he was the female. So that is just some of the Greco-Roman lifestyle and culture that the Shemitic Israelites were introduced to. Now, what we have to do now is we have to talk about the various periods and some of the civilizations that the Shemitic Israelites were living under, so we can get an understanding of how the Greco-Roman culture was introduced to them. All right. Now, most of us that are familiar with biblical history, we know that the Assyrian captivity destroyed the northern kingdom. After that, the Babylonian captivity destroyed the southern kingdom. But the Persians under Darius came and destroyed the Babylonian kingdom, and this somewhat freed the Israelite people. But of course, after that, you had Alexander the Macedonian come in, and this put them under subjugation. And this is when they became, quote unquote, Hellenized. All right. So we got a lot of reading to do. But as always, we will pause during our reading and, we'll give an analysis of what we're dealing with. Also, before we move forward, I want you to understand this, too. A lot of the Greco-Roman, especially more so through Alexander the Macedonians and a lot of the people that were with him, this was an amalgamated ethnic group of people. So Alexander more than likely was an amalgamated man between the people of Edom and the wild man of Asia Minor. OK, now you have some brothers out here who have an ideology that, quote unquote, Esau of the Bible is the Caucasian man. Me personally, I don't believe that. I believe that Esau was a Shemitic man that had recessive genetics, and he had a altered physical appearance, meaning that he didn't look like the rest of the Israelite people. He was a very hairy man. His skin may have been pale or it may have been lighter than his brother Jacob, but nevertheless, he came from a Shemitic line. And if I can remember correctly, later on, Esau married a Canaanite woman, and he also married a Ishmaelite woman. So historically in the Bible, we see that even if Esau originally was a, red man and he was a hairy man, I still believe that he was a Shemitic person originally. But once he, traveled north, he started to intermingle with some of the wild people, OK, that were coming from the mountainous regions of Asia Minor. And through this amalgamation of the Edomites and the wild people, this is where you have the Macedonians, some of these Romans, and later day, the full-blooded Caucasian that we see today. So when people say that the Caucasian comes from the Edomite or the Esau line, I agree with them in that. But I don't agree that when Isaac and his wife had their twins, Jacob and Esau, that Esau was literally a Caucasian and Jacob was an Aboriginal man. I don't believe that. I don't subscribe to that. I think later on, somewhere down the line, Esau corrupted his genetics with the wild people of Asia Minor. OK, so when I talk about Alexander the Macedonian, I'm also talking about the introduction of this Edomite line and how this Edomite line would be a thorn in the side of Israel. OK, so let's go through our history and see what we can come up with. The Persian period. The Jews fared well under Persian rule. Cyrus had given them permission to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple. And although they met oppression from the inhabitants of Palestine, it was dedicated during the reign of Darius the Great. Ezra the scribe and Nehemiah the layman sought to strengthen the Palestinian Jewish community and encourage their loyalty to the law of God. For about a century and a half after Nehemiah's time, the Persian Empire exercised control over Judea, and the Jews were permitted to observe their religious institutions without interference. Judea was ruled by high priests who were responsible to the Persian government, a fact which ensured the Jews a large measure of autonomy. At the time, however, it made a political office of the priesthood and sowed the seeds of future trouble. So what you have right here is under Darius the Great and the Persians, the Shemitic Israelite people were allowed to return to Jerusalem. They were allowed to continue their ancient practices and ancient culture. But as a liaison between the masses of Israel and the Persian government, the high priest pretty much acted as that middleman. And as it says right here, that this would sow the seeds of future trouble. This is very, very true, because this is where you're starting to get this concept of a small group representing the whole and being a middleman between between the indigenous nation and we'll say the foreign invading nation. That's very, very important for you to understand if you're going to later on understand what this Boule is, because today the so-called Boule represents a priesthood that is a middleman between the overall, quote unquote, United States society, Edomite Caucasian society, or at least the ruling elite of the Edomite Caucasian society, and the masses of the Shemitic Israelite / Aboriginal American people. OK, very, very important for you to understand that. Let's move forward. All right. Persia's failure to conquer Greece encouraged subject peoples to seek their independence. Egypt was constantly attempting to throw off the Persian yoke, and Judea, geographically between the two powers, could not escape involvement. During the reign of Artaxerxes III, many Jews were implicated in a revolt against Persia. When it failed, the Persians deported them to Babylonia and the southern shores of the Caspian Sea. Jews had long been in Egypt. Following the murder of Gedaliah, the prophet Jeremiah was forced to join a group of refugees who sought asylum at Tahpanhes in the eastern delta. And this is recorded in Jeremiah chapter 43. And other Judeans doubtless found their way to Egypt to avoid capture by Nebuchadnezzar. Migration continued during the Persian period, and by the 5th century before Christ, a Jewish colony of mercenary soldiers was located at Elephantine Island near modern Aswan at the first cataract of the Nile. Contrary to the Mosaic law, these colonists built a temple for themselves, and they combined their devotion to the God of their fathers with pagan elements. The Elephantine Jews had correspondence with the Samaritans as well as the Judeans. So what we got right here ultimately is just a brief history of the Shemitic Israelites' life under Persian rule. You have to understand that once the northern and southern kingdom was, ripped apart by the deeds of Jeroboam and Rehoboam, Israel was basically circling the toilet, and they would never ultimately get their nation back together. They were always having to, answer to some other foreign invader. And basically they were, it's unfortunate, but they were vassals. They had a vassal king. It was never like they had a full independence. And from this, a lot of the priesthood in Judea, they took advantage of this by, setting themselves up above the rest of the people. All right. So we just wanted to get, an understanding of the Persian period. Next, what we're going to do is transition into Alexander the Macedonian / the Edomite. All right. They call him Alexander the quote unquote great. I call him Alexander the Macedonian. Persia never succeeded in subduing the Greeks, but an heir of Greek culture, Alexander of Macedon, eventually brought an end to the Persian Empire. Alexander was not simply a power-mad despot. A pupil of the philosopher Aristotle, he was thoroughly convinced that Greek culture was the one force that could unify the world. In 333 BC, he passed from Macedonia into Asia Minor and defeated the Persian army stationed there. Then he moved southward towards Syria and Palestine to Egypt. Tyre and Gaza each offered stubborn resistance, but delays did not discourage Alexander. They simply strengthened his determination to win. There was no need for a campaign against the Jews, and indeed, legend makes Alexander a friend of the Jewish people. Jaddua, the high priest, is said to have come out to meet Alexander, telling him of Daniel's prophecy that the Greek army would be victorious, which is in Daniel chapter 8. Although historians do not take the story seriously, it does illustrate the friendly feelings between the Jews and the Macedonian conqueror. Alexander permitted the Jews to observe their laws, granted them exemption from tribute during sabbatical years, and he built Alexandria in Egypt in 331 BC. He encouraged Jews to settle there and gave them privileges comparable to those of his Greek subjects. So as we can see right here that Alexander the Macedonian, when he went on his, various conquests, and as I said, Macedon or the Macedonians, they were a amalgamated multi-ethnic people. So that means that they had full-blooded Aboriginal people that probably were a mix of Shemitic and Hamitic stock. They had an amalgamated group of people, which were a mixture between these indigenous people and some of these wild people that were coming out of the caves, or what they call the Caucasus or Asia Minor, coming from the east. And they also more than likely had some of the wild people with them still. So once again, we're talking about a multi-ethnic group of people. And as it says right here, when Alexander first came across these Shemitic Israelite people, that he, quote, encouraged them to settle in some of his cities that he created. And he allowed them to, practice their culture the way they saw, or at least, quote, gave them privileges comparable to those of the Greeks. Let's continue. Alexander was welcomed into Egypt as a deliverer from Persian oppression. His victorious armies retraced their steps through Palestine and Syria, then moved eastward. The cities of Babylon and Persia fell to Alexander, and he pressed on as far as Punjab region of India. Although mighty in battle, it was Hellenistic culture rather than Macedonian rule that was Alexander's legacy to the Middle East. Now, this is where things went wrong. OK, so it was more so the culture of Alexander, the culture of the Macedonians, that would throw off the equilibrium of not only the so-called Middle East, but a lot of the Western world. OK, so this Hellenistic culture, it started to spread. All right. Now, what is Hellenistic culture? I was reading about it a little bit earlier. That concept of the transgender God and stuff like that. That's part of Hellenistic culture. Let's continue. So as it says, although mighty in battle, it was Hellenistic culture rather than Macedonian rule that was Alexander's legacy to the Middle East. He determined to found a new city in each country of his empire, which would serve as a model for the reordering of the life of the country as a whole along Greek lines. Materially speaking, this meant the erection of fine public buildings, a gymnasium for games, an open-air theater, and whatever would approximate the life of a Greek city-state. Individuals were encouraged to take Greek names, adopt Greek dress, and the Greek language, in short, to become Hellenized. So although when he, approached the Judean priest, there may have not been animosity, but the culture that Alexander the Macedonian was bringing was very, very antagonistic to the Shemitic Israelite culture. And the two would clash and bump heads. So as it says right here, one of the things that, the Macedonian introduced was the concept of the gymnasium. Now, what is the gymnasium? Now, today we may think of a gymnasium or a gym as a building that may have a basketball court, a weight room, and other sports activities that people can participate in. But in the ancient world, the gymnasium, it did have certain, sporting sporting activities associated with it. But a lot of this homosexuality also was going on in these gymnasiums. So when you see these pictures of these Grecians and they wrestling each other and they're naked, that's what that culture is. And also, these were people of color doing this. OK, these were people of color doing this. All right. And it also says here that the individuals were encouraged to take on Greek names, to dress like the Greeks, to start speaking the Greek language. So this is what being Hellenized is. All right. The material aspects of Hellenism must have seemed attractive for large segments of the population. Trade and commerce brought wealth to the new merchant class. Liberties, libraries, and schools were welcomed by the scholars. Better housing and better food brought about a rise of the standard of living. Many in Israel and elsewhere were glad to accept this veneer of Greek culture. If idolatry had been the stumbling block to Israel in the pre-exilic world, Hellenism was the great post-exilic temptation. So what it's saying right here is that if idolatry was a stumbling block for the Israelite people prior to Alexander the Macedon, then it would serve to be a great temptation once the Hellenization period took over. All right. So that whole concept of, a lot of the Shemitic Israelite people starting to worship Zeus Ammon, starting to worship Athena, starting to worship Hermes and all these other, so-called gods and goddesses. That's where this is, that's where you're starting to see the rise of this. So you can already see the backdrop to these Grecian secret societies, the Grecian fraternities and sororities. OK. Now it says right here, many Jews took Greek names, accepted a school of Greek philosophy, and tried to combine the wisdom of the Greeks with the faith of their fathers. Let me repeat that. Many Jews took Greek names, accepted a Greek philosophy, and tried to combine the wisdom of Greece with the faith of their fathers. So what a lot of the Shemitic Israelite people started to do, because they were playing both sides of the field, is that they started to try to amalgamate or mix what they saw the Greeks doing with what their Shemitic ancient culture was. And of course, this is a no-no, because in Shemitic culture, homosexuality is frowned upon. OK, whereas in these Hellenized cultures, it was not. All right, let's continue. Now we have some information right here on the Ptolemies. Most of you all may know about the Ptolemies. He was one of the generals of Alexander. Let's read about it. Following the death of Alexander, Judea was first subject to Antiochus, one of his generals, but it quickly fell to another general, Ptolemy I, surnamed Soter, quote, deliverer, who seized Jerusalem on the Sabbath day in 320 BC. Ptolemy, whose kingdom centered in Egypt, dealt kindly with the Jews. Many of them settled in Alexandria, which continued to be an important center of Jewish thought for many centuries. So first, what we have is the Grecian culture introduced by Alexander the Macedonians. This concept of the gymnasium, this concept of worshiping Zeus Ammon, aka Osiris or Osar. You already have that going in. So now you can see how the melanated people were associated with that. And after Alexander's death, you have his generals fighting over power, and Ptolemy took control of Egypt. And now you have the introduction of what we call today a Roman culture. All right. So I just want you to get that backdrop of how the Roman culture and the Grecian culture was introduced. All right. Now we're going to move forward. Now, the next thing we'll read real briefly about is the Seleucids. The Syrian rulers are termed Seleucids because their kingdom, one of the successor states to Alexander's empire, was founded by Seleucus I, or Nicator. Most of the early rulers bore the name of Seleucus or Antiochus, and they ruled from Antioch on the Orontes River. The energetic ruler, Antiochus III, surnamed, quote, the Great, waged a series of battles with Egypt until 199 BC. He wrestled Palestine from the Ptolemies after the Battle of Panion near the sources of the Jordan River. This marked the beginning of a new era of Jewish history. For while the Ptolemies had been tolerant of Jewish institutions, the Seleucids determined to enforce Hellenism upon the Jews. So this is very, very important, and why I wanted to talk about the Seleucids, because as it says right here, let's reread it. It says that many of the early rulers bore the name Seleucus or Antiochus. The energetic ruler Antiochus III waged a series of battles with Egypt and seized Palestine from the Ptolemies. So remember, at first you had Alexander the Macedonian. Then after that, his war generals took over. Ptolemy was one of those generals. But after that, you have Seleucus I, or the Seleucids, and they take it from the Ptolemies. So now you can see how these various, invading groups of people, the Judeans had to deal with them. And this last sentence, it says, this marked the beginning of a new era of Jewish history. For while the Ptolemies had been tolerant of Jewish institutions, the Seleucids determined to enforce Hellenism upon the Jews. So now you're going to have this Hellenistic culture forced upon the Jewish people, meaning that now it's not about, you can go and worship in your temple the way you want. No, now you got to get with how we doing this thing. So now you're going to be forced to come to these, bathhouses. You're going to be forced to dress in a Grecian way. You're going to be forced to have a Grecian name. You're going to be forced to worship Zeus Ammon. OK, and you can see how this is going to cause a problem. Now, it already stated in here that you had a lot of Shemitic Israelite people welcoming and accepting this Grecian culture, this foreign incubus culture. So you had Shemitic Israelite people who accepted it, and you had Shemitic Israelite people who did not accept it. So we can already see an ancestral or cultural origin of the modern day, what we call sellout, quote unquote, black Boule. It started with a lot of these Shemitic Aboriginal people who welcomed this Hellenization. OK, they welcomed it on. All right. And they started to create their own secret societies and their own groups that were associated with these, pagan gods and goddesses. So they may have had the cult of Zeus Ammon, the cult of Athena, the cult of Hermes, etc., the cult of Hera, etc. OK, but they were, they were Shemitic Israelite people. OK, so a lot of the times in the Bible, it talks about, these pagan cultures that the Israelites always were having to go against. That Greco-Roman culture was one of them. All right. All right, let's see where we want to go next. Now, pretty much what happened is after Antiochus IV, and after that Hellenization, started to really come upon the people, it was a lot of issues. So let's read a little bit more right here. Antiochus determined to remove all traces of Orthodox Jewish faith. Let me repeat. Antiochus determined to remove all traces of Orthodox Jewish faith. Israel's God was identified with Jupiter, a bearded image of the pagan deity, perhaps the likeness of Antioch, was erected on the temple altar where swine was offered in sacrifice. Jews were forbidden under penalty of death to practice circumcision, Sabbath observance, or the celebration of the feast according to the Jewish calendar. Copies of the scriptures were ordered destroyed. The laws were enforced with utmost cruelty. An aide scribe named Phlezar was flogged to death because he would not eat swine's flesh. So as you can see right here, now the Shemitic Israelite people are starting to be terrorized for not taking on this Hellenization. And a lot of this was brought in by Antiochus. And as it says right here, that Israel's God was identified with Jupiter, or Zeus Ammon, the bearded god, who was basically just Antiochus. OK, so they started to correlate the biblical higher power with a lot of these false pagan gods. And that's where these ideologies, that's why these ideologies and these cross references even exist to this day. And I'll be honest with you all. It took a lot of research, and it takes a lot of research. But this is also why some of the people, including myself, you have to separate the Messiah of the scripture from these false pagan Christ of these other cultures. So when we see that blend between Horus and Yahushua, or that blend between so-called Hercules and Yahushua, or that blend between so-called Zeus and the higher power. A lot of that confusion came about during this Hellenization period, in addition to the fact that many of the people of Israel were intentionally mixing the cultures. OK, so don't feel bad if, one day, you may have been confused and thought that maybe the story about so-called Horus was talking about the story of so-called Christ. Because, in my early stages of learning, I was a little confused on that, because in the biblical historical context of the Israelites, the Messiah is not talked about as a mythological figure. He's talked about as a historical man. Whereas when you read about Zeus or Horus or these other figures, they're really mythological characters. And these mythological characters were basically based on the kings and queens of those days. All right. So they were making themselves false Christ, or these false messiahs. OK, keep that in mind. So by this point, you have a lot of Hellenized, Jews, and you have a lot of Shemitic Israelites who are being traumatized for trying to practice their original culture. This is one of the reasons why today most of us don't know what our original culture is, because it was beat out of you. People were killed for it. As it said right here, there was an elder Israelite man who was killed because he wouldn't eat swine's flesh. OK, so real quick, let's read about the Maccabean Revolt. The oppressed Jews were not long in finding a champion. When the emissaries of Antiochus arrived at the village of Molden, about 15 miles west of Jerusalem, they expected the aged priest Matthias to set a good example to his people by coming forward to offer a pagan sacrifice. When Matthias refused, a timid Jew came forward to perform the sacrifice. Listen to that. It says when Matthias refused, a timid Jew came forward to perform the sacrifice. So you had a lot of scared Israelites in that day, trying to buck dance, bootlicking, ass kissing, because they didn't want to make these Greco-Romans mad. All right. And of course, you can see how this can cause a division in Israel. Let's move forward. It says the enraged priests approached the altar and slew both the apostate Jew and the emissary of Antiochus. With his 5 sons, Matthias destroyed the heathen altar and then fled to the hills to avoid reprisal. Others of Orthodox persuasion joined the family of Matthias in waging guerrilla warfare on the Syrians and the Hellenistic Jews who supported them. I'm going to repeat that. Others, meaning other Israelites of Orthodox persuasion, joined the family of Matthias, who was a high priest that killed them sellout scared Jews and destroyed them pagan altars. It says others of Orthodox persuasion joined the family of Matthias in waging guerrilla warfare on the Syrians or the Seleucids and the Hellenized Jews who supported them. So that means that the Maccabean revolt was against this Greco-Roman invasion, and it was also against the Shemitic Israelites who had converted over into this Hellenism. OK, so these Hellenized Jews, these are the forefathers and foremothers of these Boule Greek fraternities and Greek sororities. All right. All right, let's see where we want to go next. All right, it says, on one Sabbath, a band of the Orthodox was surrounded and slaughtered, for they would not defend themselves. Following this episode, Matthias suggested the principle that fighting in self-defense is permissible on the Sabbath day. Soon after the beginning of the revolt, Matthias died. He urged his followers to choose as military leader his third son, Judas, Hebrew Judah, known as the Maccabee, a word usually interpreted to mean the hammer. The choice was a good one, for more and more Jews rallied to the cause. The Maccabees and the followers of Judas, not the sellout Judas, but the son of Matthias, were able to hold their own against a series of Syrian armies thrown against them. By a surprise night attack, Judas annihilated an army of Syrians and Hellenistic-minded Jews at Emmaus, and then marched towards Jerusalem with the booty he had seized. The Maccabees entered the city and took everything except the Akra. They entered the temple and removed all the signs of paganism which had been installed there. The altar dedicated to Jupiter was removed and a new altar erected to Israel's God. The statue of Jupiter was ground to dust. OK, so as you can see right here, you had the Shemitic Israelite warriors go in and killed up all these Hellenized Jews and killed up all these Syrians, these Greco-Roman amalgamated Edomites that were invading. OK. And as it continues, let's see where we want to go next. Where do we want to go next? I kind of want to skip over to the Romans. So let's talk about this real quick. So basically where we at right here is that you have these, the Maccabean Revolt, which was led by the high priest Matthias and his sons against these Hellenized Jews and these Syrian generals. And it was a long fight. But in the end, the Shemitic Israelite people didn't get the type of freedom that they really were looking for. OK, and a lot of them had to run and hide. And, it didn't really end with the way they wanted it to. OK, so you still have a continuing period of Hellenization continuing. And a lot of Israelite people still getting caught up in this. All right. And a lot of the heirs or the descendants of the Maccabees, some of them eventually became Hellenized. All right. So as you can just see right here, you have these Shemitic Israelite people being attacked by, being attacked by this Hellenization, aka this Greco-Roman culture. And they're doing their best to fight it off. All right. Now, where we want to go next? Okay. Let's talk a little bit about the Romans. Now, when we use that term Idumea or Idumaea, that is another word for Edom or the Edomites. OK, so that's why I got that correlation with the Romans and the Edomites. All right. Also, some of the Macedonians, they were descendants of the Edomites. All right. So now we can see this battle between Israel and Edom, aka the battle between Jacob and Esau. All right. The battle between Rome and Israel, which is still going on today. All right. So the battle of Jacob and Esau is the battle of Rome and Israel. All right. So let's see. Let's see. Well, what I want to do right here real quick is just basically we're going to just talk about we all know about the Roman situation because that's what your New Testament is about. And your New Testament is ultimately when Yahushua or Yahushua, the Messiah, when he was born and the culture he was born into, it was this Roman Hellenized culture. And the Pharisee class that he was dealing with and going to war with and battling with at that day, they will represent the Boule class of that day. So that middleman group, between the greater nation of Israel and the Roman government, it was the Pharisee class. OK, and these Pharisees were, continuing a lot of that behavior that the high priest class started during the time of Darius and the Persians. OK, so remember now you're starting to have these Shemitic priests, these Israelite priests starting to try to separate themselves from the greater mass of the people. And a lot of them started, get the big head. They started to get real strict with the laws. And a lot of them were hypocrites. That's why when Yahushua went into the temple and he saw the money changers in there, a lot of what they were doing is they were taking a lot of the Gentile people, which were basically Israelites that were spread about. And they were trying to relearn their culture. So they would come into Jerusalem to, worship and provide resources, monetary resources. And when they would convert, through foreign exchange, convert their money into Judean money, it was the priest, or the merchants, the money changers that were responsible for that. And when Yahushua went, for one, he saw that they had turned, the temple basically into a bank, and he didn't like that. And then he also saw that they had very, very harsh monetary practices, meaning that they were, cheating people out of money. So when you read about him turning the tables over That's what that's all about. And of course, this caused a problem with a lot of these Pharisee class because they were making a lot of money off of that. So what they began to do was conspire against him. And they went and, ultimately got the Roman government to try to assassinate him. OK, so you still having that battle between this Hellenization of the people, these little groups and cults within Israel separating themselves, working with the invading culture, working with the invading nation, and ultimately helping them destroy their own people. All right. So understand that that's what the whole situation that Yahushua was dealing with. He was dealing with this Boule class of that day that was working with Rome to conspire against the greater Israelite community. All right. So that's who the Pharisees are. And of course, you have your Sadducees, Pharisees and the Sadducees were basically just these niggas that thought they knew the law and they were hypocrites. And a lot of that is what Yahushua went against. So the next thing I want to do, so to put a good, nice bow on that, what we did was just went through the history of Hellenization, how that was introduced to the Shemitic Israelite people, some of the origins of that Greco-Roman culture or the Boule group, these secret society, black Greek fraternities and sororities, when it pertains to people of color. That's some of the history we just went over. And we also talked about how the Edomites or the children of Esau, through the Macedonians and through the Romans, would go to war with the descendants of Jacob, aka the Israelites. All right. So that was just prophecy being fulfilled when Rachel, or the mother of Jacob and Esau, the prophecy that she was told that her two sons or these two nations would basically not get along with each other. OK, and it's still going on to this day. So before we move forward, some people they talk about the Boule class today. And today we may see the Boule class answering to these Caucasian bleached out Edomite families and their secret societies. But originally they were amalgamated and they originally were a full blooded group. So although the Boule class are answering to some of these Caucasian groups, don't be surprised if some of these amalgamated, meaning we'll call mulatto so-called blacks, or maybe even some full so-called blacks who still are existing today, and they actually rule the Caucasian ones. OK, so don't be too quick to think that the Boule class are under the Caucasians, because they may not be. That may be another deception just to keep us tricked, to make us think that the Caucasian ruling elite class is the highest on the totem pole, where it may be some of these bleached out descendants of these Boule groups from the times of Yahushua, from the times of the medieval period all the way up till today. OK, now the next thing I want to do real quick is we're going to talk about the more ancient version of, I'm not going to necessarily call it the Boule, but I'll call it a secret society that is choosing to conspire against the greater nation of the people. And you see that during, the Tower of Babel. OK, so let's briefly read the definition. All right. Tower of Babel. It was the capital of Babylonia, or Shinar, also called Chaldea. Its ruins are near the present city of Hilla, southwest of Baghdad, Iraq, on a small tributary of the Euphrates. Its temple of Baal, or Marduk, the city god, a ziggurat or step tower, is the biblical Tower of Babel. It was a splendid and magnificent city and became to the people of Israel a symbol of all that was wicked. In New Testament times, it became a symbolic name for Rome. I'm going to repeat. In New Testament times, it became a symbolic name for Rome. So that's why a lot of times you will see the Romans correlated with the Babylonians. All right. The ancient Babylonians, or ancient Babel, under the rulership of the Cushites and Nimrod, that was also a little secret cult or a collective group of people who were conspiring against the masses. And during that time period, you had a battle between the order of Melchizedek, or the priesthood of Shem, and the Tower of Babel. So in the Bible, it says that God saw that the Tower of Babel and that man was starting to get to, trying to raise into the heavens. And of course, that the Tower of Babel was destroyed and confusion was brought about the tongue and the people were dispersed around the world. But in addition to that, it was also the priesthood of Shem, the order of Melchizedek, who destroyed that Cushite evil Tower of Babel. OK, now in the Bible, sometimes it'll be hard to figure out that Shem is Melchizedek. But just through research, you'll find out that Shem and Melchizedek is the same person. So in Hebrews chapter 7, I think, they talk about the order of Melchizedek, all right, or the priesthood of Melchizedek, or the priesthood of Shem. And how do we know that Shem was the priesthood of that day? Because after the war that Abraham engaged in to free Lot, he went and paid tithes and tribute to Melchizedek, aka Shem, because he was the high priest of that day. So Shem was the first high priest, or Melchizedek was the first high priest post the flood, meaning that when Noah's 3 sons got off the ark, Shem was the high priest because Shem is the only one that took the information and culture that Noah taught him and did it the right way. Whereas Ham took it and eventually turned it into a pagan Tower of Babel type culture. So later on, that's where your Assyrians, your Egyptians, your Grecians, your Macedonians, your Romans, that's where their pagan culture came from. It came from that ancient Babylonian culture. All right. So that cult of Nimrod is also like the cult of Zeus Ammon. OK, the cult of the Hellenized Jews. All right. It's just generation to generation. They changing names. Today, we call them the so-called black boule or the black bourgeoisie. All right. But ultimately, we're talking about that same type of faction of people. OK, so to get ready to wrap the tape up, that's kind of your origin of your Hellenized, boule class of today. It originally started in Babel under the Cushites and Nimrod. And that blueprint that he laid out basically was continued on in history by a lot of different groups of people. Some of the Assyrians tried to resurrect it. Some of the Grecians tried to resurrect it. And some of the Romans tried to resurrect it. All right. And today you still battling against it. OK, so that's ultimately where that came from. And the reason why you see these so-called blacks today joining these Grecian sororities and fraternities, because they are Hellenized Jews. So any so-called black man or black male or female that's in a fraternity or sorority, they are these Hellenized Jews. They are the ones that you was going against in the Maccabean Revolt. So if you one of these brothers or sisters and you tend to have more of a traditional Israelite Muslim thought process, you tend to try to follow the original culture that is described in the Bible and the Quran, then you represent that group of Matthias and those Israelites using guerrilla warfare to go against those Hellenized Jews and them bleached out Syrians. OK, so understand that just like you see on this screen, this black devil, the original black devils were the cult of Babel or the cult of Nimrod. The original black devils were the cult of Zeus Ammon and these Hellenized Jews. The original black devils was that damn cult of Caiaphas and them sellout Israelites that were working with the Roman government that conspired against the Mashiach or the Messiah, Yahushua. OK, so those are the black devils. So the black boule, these are your black devils. That's them on the screen right here that you see. All right. Understand that. When we think about the so-called talented 10th, W.E.B. Du Bois, that guy Henry McKenton, and I think in 1904 that started the so-called boule, and how a lot of them were an amalgamated people, meaning a lot of them had either a Caucasian mother or father and an Aboriginal Shemitic Israelite so-called mother or father. That amalgamation, that's why a lot of them are light skinned. And depending on who your family line is, you can't even marry into some of these boule families. OK, that's ultimately what that is. So W.E.B. Du Bois, the founder of the boule, the talented 10th, after the so-called Civil War in 1865, from 1865 up until about the early 1900s, you had a reemergence, OK, of these Hellenized Jewish bleached out people working with these Edomites. So you have a coalition of Hellenized Jews and Edomites working together to go against the greater nation of Israel. When you think about the Democratic Party, the Ku Klux Klan, Margaret Sanger, and these abortion clinics, this miseducation system, and while a lot of these so-called black children have poor arithmetic and poor reading skills, you got to understand that most of these leaders in these so-called black counties, you know, that are ruling the education system, that are the superintendents, the school psychologists, all the professionals, a lot of them are these Greek fraternity and Greek sorority people. And what you don't know is that behind closed doors, they are working and they are in league with a lot of these Caucasians. So this is why it's so easy for a young black male to end up in special education, because they have to do their part by investing in that prison industrial pipeline between the school system and the prison system. So the Caucasian Edomite can make his money. And then the Boule get their kickback from that. OK, so that's why they're in all these prominent positions. The accountants, the lawyers. That's why W.E.B. Du Bois said we want to take the 10% or the talented 10th of the so-called black community, and we will separate ourselves, and we will be the elite class, and we will be the middleman between the greater nation of so-called black Americans and the bleached out Edomite Caucasian secret societies. And that guy Henry McKinton and some of them other Boule niggas, they started that. And your whole Divine Nine, it branched off from that. OK. So, you know, this is some of the reason why the so-called black masses can't seem to rise in prominence. It's not really these Caucasians. That's not who it is. It's these Hellenized Jews. It's these Boule. You know, these niggas that look just like you, but they're really black devils. OK, it's them. And you've been battling them since the ancient world. All right. It's nothing new. OK. And as I said, Idumea / the Roman Edomites were going against the Moorish Israelites and the Moorish Muslims. OK, so that Maccabean revolt between the Hellenized Jews and these bleached out Edomites, the Macedonians, the Seleucids, these bleached out Syrians, they went against the Orthodox original Moorish Israelites and Muslims. OK, so you can see, you know, based on the culture and based on how you see things, what side of the field you on. All right. And that's pretty much what we're dealing with. OK, so hopefully this tape, you know, answers some questions about, you know, who these people are. And all this history is recorded in the Bible, and you can find it there. But you all stay, you know, tuned for the next classic. Hit me up in the comment section. Let me know what you think. I'm out.